The rain over the Potomac River didn't just fall, it punished, turning the manicured lawns of the Maryland estate into a blurred landscape of gray and green. Rhea stood at the edge of the obsidian-tiled driveway, her fingers white-knuckled around 3 leather leashes, her cheap windbreaker clinging to her skin like a second, shivering layer of ice. But it wasn't the freezing wind that made her breath hitch, it was the man standing under the massive black umbrella held by a silent guard. Kael, the undisputed shadow of the East Coast's underground, looked at her soaked clothes and the mud caked onto her boots with a sneer that could wither a saint. He was a vision of lethal elegance in a charcoal suit that cost more than Rhea would earn in 3 years, his eyes sharp, dark.
You should learn your place before you regret it. This is your last warning. You should learn your place before you regret it. This is your last warning.
He didn't wait for her to defend herself. He didn't see the flash of defiance in her amber eyes or the way she stood her ground against the gale. If you're ready to see this arrogant king brought to his knees by the woman he despises, make sure you hit that follow button and subscribe right now to see every chapter of her revenge. Kael turned to whistle for his prize, a massive, silver-furred timber wolf named Ghost that had never known a master's hand. He expected the beast to tear this intruder apart for stepping onto his sacred ground. He expected blood. But as the wolf stepped out of the shadows of the porch, the world went silent. The wolf didn't growl. It didn't strike. It did the one thing Kael never thought possible. It lowered its massive head, tucked its tail in a sign of absolute submission, and bowed at Rhea's muddy feet. Kael's grip tightened on the handle of his umbrella, his knuckles turning a ghostly white as he stared at the impossible sight of his apex predator acting like a common cur. Ghost was not a dog, he was a relic of the wilderness, a creature Kael had brought back from the deepest forests of Idaho to serve as a living warning to his enemies. The wolf had bitten generals and ignored the commands of the most hardened mercenaries, yet here he was, whining softly at the touch of a girl who looked like she didn't have $1 to her name. "Get that beast away from her," Kael barked, his voice vibrating with a sudden, inexplicable territorial rage. He hated the way Rhea didn't flinch. He hated the way she reached out a slender, trembling hand to scratch the wolf behind its ears, her touch confident and practiced. To Kael, she was nothing but a nuisance, a beggarly dog walker his sister, Hannah, had hired out of some misplaced sense of charity. He saw the world in hierarchies of power and wealth, and in his eyes, Rhea was at the very bottom of the food chain. He saw the frayed edges of her sleeves and the way she bit her lip to keep it from trembling, misinterpreting her cold for fear. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes splashing into a puddle, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain swirling around them. "I don't know what trick you've used to mesmerize my animal, but your services are no longer required," he hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. Rhea could see the golden flecks in his dark irises, the sheer intensity of a man who was used to the world bending to his will. She didn't move. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him with a pity that burned hotter than his hatred. "He isn't mesmerized, Mr. Kael," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm. "He just recognizes someone who doesn't need to bark to be heard." The air between them charged with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing over the Maryland sky. Kael felt a jolt of something he couldn't name, a spark of intrigue buried deep under layers of cold calculation. He watched as Rhea turned her back on him, a move that would have cost anyone else their life, and began to lead the other dogs toward the service entrance. Ghost followed her, his head still low, ignoring Kael's sharp command to return to his side. It was a public humiliation in front of his guards, a crack in the armor of the man who ruled New York and Maryland with an iron fist. Kael watched her go, his mind racing to find a reason for the wolf's betrayal. He told himself it was the scent of the other dogs. He told himself it was the rain messing with the animal's instincts. But deep down, a seed of doubt was planted. He didn't know that Rhea wasn't just a walker. He didn't know that she had spent her childhood in the rugged mountains of Washington, raised by a grandfather who understood the language of the wild better than the language of men. He didn't know that she carried a secret in the locket hidden beneath her soaked shirt, a secret that linked her to the very origins of the wolf Kael claimed to own. As Rhea disappeared into the shadows of the mansion, Kael signaled his lead enforcer, Chris, to step forward. "I want a full file on her by tonight," Kael ordered, his eyes never leaving the doorway where she had vanished. "Every debt, every relative, every breath she's ever taken. I want to know why a beggar thinks she can look a king in the eye." Chris nodded, already pulling out his phone, but the look on Kael's face wasn't one of victory. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was playing a game he didn't understand. Inside the warmth of the servants' quarters, Rhea stripped off her wet jacket, her heart finally beginning to settle into a heavy thud. She knew she shouldn't have spoken back. She knew that men like Kael didn't just fire people, they erased them. But something about the way he had looked at her, as if she were less than the mud on his driveway, had snapped something inside her. She had spent years hiding, moving from Connecticut to New York and finally to Maryland, trying to stay off the radar of the people who had destroyed her family. Being a dog walker was the perfect cover. She was invisible, a part of the background noise of the wealthy. But Ghost had recognized her. The wolf had seen through the beggarly disguise to the bloodline that still ran true. She knelt on the floor, Ghost immediately pressing his large, wet head against her chest, letting out a low chuff of recognition. "You're going to get me killed, Ghost," she whispered into his fur, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. She knew that Kael would be digging into her past now. She knew that the quiet life she had built was over. But as she looked at the wolf, she felt a surge of the old strength, the fire of the pack that had once ruled the northern forests. If Kael wanted a war, he would get one, but he had no idea that he was bringing a wolf into his own home. He thought he was the predator, the king of the concrete jungle, but he was about to learn that some things can't be bought, and some spirits can't be broken. What he didn't know was that his sister hadn't hired Rhea out of charity, she had hired her out of fear. Back in his study, surrounded by the glow of multiple monitors and the scent of aged bourbon, Kael stared at the initial report Chris had dumped on his desk. Name, Rhea. Age, 24. Address, a cramped apartment in a part of Maryland Kael wouldn't even drive through. No criminal record. No family. A ghost. It was too clean. It was too perfect. Kael took a long sip of his drink, the amber liquid burning his throat. He kept seeing the way Ghost had bowed. It haunted him. In the Mafia world, loyalty was everything, and his own wolf had just defected to a girl who didn't even own a car. He felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the mystery of her, a need to break her or own her, he wasn't sure which. He picked up his phone and dialed his sister, Hannah. "Why did you hire her?" he demanded without a greeting. Hannah's voice was small, hesitant on the other end. She has a way with animals, Kael. And she needed the work." Kael scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. "She's a liability. She's gone." But Hannah's next words stopped him cold. "You can't fire her, Kael. If she leaves, Ghost will stop eating. He hasn't touched his food in 3 days, and the only time he calmed down was when she arrived this morning. If you want to keep your symbol of power alive, you have to keep the beggar." Kael hung up the phone, his face a mask of cold fury. He was being held hostage by a dog walker and a wolf. He looked out the window at the storm, seeing his own reflection in the dark glass. He thought he was the one in control. He thought he was the one holding the leashes. But as the lightning illuminated the grounds, he saw a lone figure walking away through the gates, her head held high, the wolf watching her from the porch with glowing eyes. He didn't know the truth yet, but the hunt had already begun. This was only the beginning of a game where the stakes were more than just power, they were life and death. The morning light over the Maryland estate was cold and unforgiving, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kael's private study like a silent interrogation. He hadn't slept. Instead, he had spent the dark hours rewatching the security footage of the driveway, his eyes fixed on the moment Ghost, his lethal, silent shadow, had lowered his head to the girl in the muddy boots. On the screen, Rhea looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place against the backdrop of his empire, yet the wolf's submission suggested a power that Kael couldn't quantify. He tapped a rhythm on his mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a ticking clock as he waited for her to arrive for her first full day of service. He had decided to move her into the estate, ostensibly to keep the wolf from starving, but in reality, he wanted her under his roof where he could watch every breath she took. When the heavy iron gates finally groaned open, he didn't see a girl seeking a paycheck, he saw a threat wrapped in a worn-out flannel shirt. Rhea walked up the drive with a grace that didn't match her bank account, her eyes scanning the security cameras with a knowing flick of her gaze that made Kael's skin prickle. She wasn't just a walker, she was a survivor, and every step she took on his property felt like a tactical insertion. Make sure you're subscribed right now, because the trap Kael is about to set is one he might just fall into himself. He met her in the grand foyer, the air suddenly thick with the scent of pine and something ancient that seemed to cling to her skin. "You're late," he stated, his voice a low vibration that usually made his subordinates tremble. Rhea didn't tremble. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her amber eyes meeting his dark, calculating stare with a level of defiance that was practically an insult. "The bus from the city doesn't care about mafia schedules, Mr. Kael," she replied, her voice smooth and unimpressed. Kael felt a surge of that same, irritating heat in his chest, a mixture of fury and a curiosity so sharp it felt like a physical ache. He gestured toward the back gardens where Ghost was pacing his enclosure, the wolf's agitation visible even from a distance. "My sister says you have a way with him. Prove it. If he doesn't eat from your hand within the hour, you leave this property and you never look back." It was an impossible test. Ghost had never eaten from anyone's hand, not even Kael's, and the wolf was currently in a state of near-rabid hunger. Rhea didn't hesitate. She walked toward the enclosure, her movements fluid and calm, ignoring the guards who tracked her with their rifles. Kael followed, standing just far enough away to watch her failure, his arms crossed over his chest. As Rhea reached the iron bars, Ghost stopped his pacing. The wolf's growl died in his throat, replaced by a soft, high-pitched whine that sounded like a greeting to a long-lost friend. Rhea knelt in the dirt, ignoring the stains on her jeans, and reached into her bag to pull out a simple piece of dried venison. She didn't throw it. She didn't command. She simply held it in her open palm and whispered a single word in a language Kael didn't recognize, a guttural, melodic sound that seemed to hum in the very air. Ghost stepped forward, his massive paws silent on the grass, and gently, almost reverently, took the meat from her hand. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't just training, it was a bond, a deep-seated connection that defied every law of the wild he understood. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over her, his presence a heavy weight of authority. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his voice tight. "What was that word?" Rhea stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, her face a mask of cool indifference. "It's just a trick, Mr. Kael. Like you said, I'm just a beggarly dog walker." She turned to leave, but Kael grabbed her arm, his fingers circling her wrist with a grip that was firm but not painful. The contact was like a jolt of electricity. A spark that made Rhea's breath hitch and Kael's eyes darken. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between them, the billionaire boss and the girl from the streets, the predator and the mystery. He could feel her pulse racing under his thumb, a frantic, rhythmic beat that told him she wasn't as unaffected as she pretended to be. "I don't like mysteries in my house, Rhea," he whispered, his face inches from hers, the scent of her skin, rain and wild herbs, filling his senses. "And I don't like being lied to." Rhea pulled her arm back, her eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous fire. "Then maybe you shouldn't have invited a wolf into your home," she snapped, her voice low and edged with a warning he should have heeded. She walked away toward the servants' wing, leaving Kael standing in the garden with his beast, who was now watching him with an intelligence that felt almost mocking. He felt a sudden, chilling realization. He had brought her here to control her, but the more time she spent within these walls, the more he felt the foundations of his world shifting. He retreated to his study, slamming the door, and found Chris waiting with a new file. "We found something, boss," Chris said, his face pale in the dim light. "The address she gave us for her childhood home in Washington? It doesn't exist. But there were reports of a private estate in that area that burned down 15 years ago, a place owned by a family the locals called the Guardians." Kael felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered the stories of the Guardians, a mythic clan of trackers who supposedly shared blood with the great wolves of the north. He had always dismissed them as bedtime stories told to children in the underworld to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But as he looked out the window and saw Rhea sitting on the porch, the massive wolf's head resting in her lap as if she were a queen on her throne, the myth felt a lot like reality. He realized then that he hadn't just hired a dog walker, he had invited a ghost into his sanctuary, and she was carrying the embers of a fire he thought had been extinguished decades ago. The tension in the house began to coil like a spring, every interaction between them a battle of wills that left Kael feeling more unmoored. He tried to ignore her, tried to treat her like the help, but he found himself watching her on the monitors, mesmerized by the way she moved, the way she spoke to the animals, the way she seemed to belong to the land in a way he never could. He was the owner of the estate, the king of the city, but in her presence, he felt like a squatter in a kingdom he didn't understand. What she said next changed everything, because as he passed her in the hall later that night, she didn't look away. She stopped, her hand hovering over the locket hidden beneath her shirt, and looked him dead in the eye. "You think you're the one holding the leash, Kael," she said, her voice a chilling promise of the chaos to come. "But a wolf only bows to what it fears, or what it loves. And it doesn't love you." She disappeared into the darkness of the corridor before he could respond, leaving him alone in the silence of his own empire, the realization dawning on him that the hunt he thought he was leading had just turned him into the prey. If you want to know what's inside that locket and why it makes a mafia boss tremble, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the reveal that changes everything. The moon hung like a jagged shard of ice over the Chesapeake Bay, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sprawling Maryland estate as Kael stood on his balcony, the smoke from his black clove cigarette swirling into the frigid night air. He couldn't stop thinking about the locket, the way Rhea's hand had flown to it like a shield when he stepped too close, a gesture of survival that seemed out of place for a girl who supposedly had nothing worth protecting. Below him, in the silver-drenched grass, he saw her, a small, defiant silhouette walking toward the edge of the woods where the security lights faded into the ink-black tree-line. She wasn't supposed to be out there at 2 a.m., and Ghost, the beast that usually prowled the perimeter with a predatory hunger, was walking at her side like a loyal knight guarding his queen. Kael's jaw tightened, the embers of his cigarette glowing a fierce, angry red as he turned and headed for the stairs, his heart thumping with a mixture of suspicion and a dark, obsessive need to know what she was hiding in the dark. If you're enjoying the mystery of the Guardian's secret, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video so you don't miss the moment the truth is finally revealed. He caught up to her near the old stone well at the edge of the property, the air here smelling of damp earth and the heavy, metallic scent of an approaching storm. Running away so soon, little dog walker, he called out, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that sliced through the rustle of the leaves. Rhea stopped, but she didn't turn around, her shoulders tensing as Ghost let out a low, vibrating hum of warning that resonated in Kael's very bones. I don't run, Kael. I just prefer the company of those who don't feel the need to hide behind iron gates and armed guards, she replied, her voice carrying a sting that made Kael's blood boil. He stepped into her space, his presence an overwhelming force of expensive cologne and raw authority, forcing her to look at him as he reached out and hooked a finger under the silver chain around her neck. Rhea gasped, her hands flying up to stop him, but Kael was faster, his grip firm as he pulled the locket into the moonlight, his eyes narrowing at the intricate, hand-carved design of a howling wolf circling a sun, the sigil of the family that was supposed to have burned to ash in Washington 15 years ago. This isn't the jewelry of a beggar, he hissed, his face so close to hers that he could see the reflection of the moon in her wide, panicked eyes. This belongs to the Northeast's lost royalty, the ones who controlled the trade routes before my father ever drew a breath. What she did next changed everything, because instead of begging for mercy or denying the truth, Rhea grabbed his lapels and pulled him down, her voice a lethal whisper that chilled him more than the Maryland winter. If you know what that symbol means, then you know you're already standing on a grave, Kael. And it won't be mine. She pushed him back with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone her size, leaving Kael stumbling as Ghost stepped between them, his teeth bared in a silent, terrifying snarl that made it clear who the wolf truly served. Kael felt a jolt of genuine fear, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he took over the Mafia throne in New York, but beneath the fear was a skyrocketing thrill. He realized then that he didn't just want to break her, he wanted to understand the fire that burned within her, a fire that threatened to consume his entire empire if he didn't find a way to tame it. He watched her disappear into the thicket, the wolf at her heels, and he knew that the beggarly dog walker was the most dangerous person he had ever invited into his home. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare, because as Kael returned to the mansion, he found Chris waiting in the foyer with a look of pure terror on his face. Boss, we've got a problem. The Idaho Syndicate, the ones who sold you the wolf, they just touched down at the private airfield in D.C. They're claiming Ghost was stolen from a sacred site, and they want him back, or they'll burn everything from here to Connecticut to find him. Kael felt the world tilt on its axis, the realization hitting him like a physical blow that Rhea wasn't just a survivor of the fire, she was the prize they were all looking for. He looked up the grand staircase toward the room where Rhea was supposed to be sleeping, but he knew she wouldn't be there. She was part of the forest now, a ghost in the machine of his life. He had spent his whole life thinking he was the hunter, the apex predator who decided who lived and who died, but as the first raindrops began to hammer against the roof, he understood that he was just a pawn in a game that had started long before he was born. The tension in the room was suffocating as he realized that to protect his empire, he might have to protect the woman who hated him most in the world. He turned to Chris, his voice cold and resolute, the mask of the Mafia Boss clicking back into place. Assemble the team. We're going into the woods. And tell everyone to keep their eyes on the trees. The Guardians don't like trespassers, and I have a feeling we're about to meet more than just one girl with a locket. He grabbed his coat and a heavy-duty flashlight, the weight of his weapon at his hip a small comfort against the ancient power he was about to face. He didn't know the truth yet, but the wolf wasn't the only thing that bowed to Rhea. The very shadows of the Maryland woods seemed to part for her, and Kael was about to find out exactly what happens when you call a queen a beggar. Every step he took into the dark felt like a descent into a world he wasn't prepared for, a world where money and guns meant nothing against the primal bond of the pack. He could hear the distant howl of a wolf, not Ghost, but something larger, something older, echoing through the valley, and he knew that the war for the East Coast had officially begun. If you're ready to see Kael fight for the woman he once looked down on, you better stay tuned, because the hunt is no longer about power, it's about survival. The roar of a blacked-out Gulfstream jet cutting through the Maryland fog was the first sign that the world Kael had built was about to collide with a past he had no right to touch. At the private hangar near Annapolis, the air smelled of jet fuel and impending violence as the door hissed open, revealing a man named David, the enforcer for the Idaho syndicate whose face was a map of scars and cold, calculated cruelty. David didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a butcher who had traded his apron for a tailored suit, and as he stepped onto the tarmac, he didn't ask for a meeting or a drink. He simply pointed toward the distant, dark silhouette of the Potomac woods. "The girl and the beast, Kael. Give them to us, and we leave your little empire standing." David's voice was like grinding stones, devoid of the elegance Kael used to mask his own brutality. Kael stood his ground, his hand resting on the holster at his hip, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios where he handed Rhea over and went back to his life of luxury, yet every time he pictured her amber eyes, he felt a visceral, sickening pull in his gut that wouldn't let him walk away. He had called her a beggar, he had treated her like dirt, but the thought of David's hands on her made a dark, possessive rage flare up in his chest that overshadowed any business logic. Make sure you're watching closely and hit that like button right now, because the choice Kael makes in this moment will either save his soul or burn his kingdom to the ground. Kael didn't answer with words, he answered with the cold click of his safety being switched off, a sound that resonated through the hangar like a declaration of war. David smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth that signaled the end of diplomacy. "Have it your way, king of nothing. We'll take her from the dirt where she belongs." Kael didn't wait to see them move. He spun around and sprinted for his SUV, the tires screaming against the asphalt as he roared back toward the estate, his only thought being that he had to get to Rhea before the monsters did. But Rhea wasn't waiting to be saved. Deep in the heart of the woods, where the canopy was so thick the rain felt like a distant memory, she knelt in a circle of ancient oaks, her fingers buried deep in ghost silver fur as the wolf let out a low, mournful howl that seemed to pull the very shadows closer. She could feel them coming, not just Kael, but the men from the mountains, the ones who had killed her grandfather and turned her home in Washington into a pyre of cedar and bone. She wasn't the beggarly dog walker they thought she was. She was the last thread of a lineage that had guarded the gate between the wild and the world for centuries, and her blood was a key they were desperate to turn. What she did next changed everything, because as Kael's headlights finally cut through the trees, he didn't find a trembling girl. He found a warrior standing in the center of a clearing, the locket around her neck glowing with a faint, pulse-like light that matched the rhythm of the forest. Kael slammed on the brakes and jumped out, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his suit jacket discarded and his silk shirt clinging to his skin. "Rhea, get in the car. They're here, and they don't want to talk," he shouted, but the words felt hollow in the presence of the raw, primal energy radiating from her. Rhea looked at him, and for the first time, the defiance in her eyes was tempered with a strange, tragic pity. "You should have stayed in your ivory tower, Kael. You're a king of men, but out here, you're just prey," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Kael's heart skip a beat. Before he could respond, a hail of gunfire shattered the silence, the syndicate's mercenaries emerging from the shadows like ghosts, their suppressed rifles spitting lead into the trees. Kael dove for cover behind his SUV, pulling his own weapon and returning fire with the precision that had made him the most feared man on the East Coast, but he was outnumbered 10-1. He saw David stepping into the clearing, a heavy-caliber handgun raised toward Rhea, and for a split second, Kael's world went into slow motion. He didn't think about his business, he didn't think about his reputation, he simply threw himself across the open ground, his body a shield between the girl he had once insulted and the bullet meant to end her life. The impact was a dull, hot thud against his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the mud at Rhea's feet. Pain exploded in his vision, a white-hot bloom that threatened to pull him into the dark, but as he looked up, he saw Rhea's face change, the cool mask of indifference shattered into a look of pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't scream, she let out a sound that wasn't human, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to make the very earth beneath them tremble. Ghost didn't wait for a command. The wolf transformed into a blur of silver and teeth, a whirlwind of natural violence that tore through the mercenary line with a speed no human eye could track. Men screamed as the wolf moved like a shadow, striking and vanishing before a single shot could be fired in return. David backed away, his face pale with a terror he had never known, realizing too late that he hadn't come to hunt a girl, he had come to wake a goddess. Rhea knelt beside Kael, her hands pressing against the wound in his shoulder, her touch surprisingly warm and steady. "Why?" she whispered, the word lost in the chaos of the battle. Kael looked up at her, a weak, blood-stained smile tugging at his lips despite the agony. "I told you. I don't like people touching my things," he managed to choke out, the arrogance still there but flavored with a desperate honesty. He grabbed her hand, his fingers slick with blood, and for a moment, the gap between the Mafia Boss and the beggar disappeared, leaving only two souls caught in the center of a storm. But that was only the beginning of the horror, because as the last of the mercenaries fled into the dark, a new sound began to echo through the Maryland woods, a deep, resonant drumming that seemed to come from the ground itself. David was gone, vanished into the trees, but he had left something behind, a parting gift from the Idaho syndicate that made even Ghost stop and tuck his tail. From the darkness beyond the clearing, eyes began to glow, not 2 or 4, but dozens of them, amber and hungry, circling the clearing with a tactical precision that was far beyond any natural pack. Kael felt the hair on his neck stand up as he realized the syndicate hadn't just brought men, they had brought their own twisted version of the pack, creatures bred for war and devoid of the nobility Rhea's family had once protected. He tried to stand, his vision swimming, but Rhea pushed him back down, her eyes fixed on the approaching shadows. "Stay down, Kael. This isn't your fight anymore," she said, her hand moving to the clasp of her locket. He didn't know the truth yet, but the secret inside that silver heart was about to turn the Potomac into a river of fire, and Kael was about to find out that the woman he called a beggarly dog walker was the only thing standing between him and a darkness he couldn't even imagine. The circle of amber eyes tightened around them, a ring of predatory fire closing in on the wounded king and the girl he had once dared to mock. Kael lay in the Maryland mud, his breath hitching as the metallic tang of his own blood filled the air, watching through a blur of pain as the creatures from the Idaho syndicate emerged from the gloom, monsters that looked like wolves but moved with an unnatural, twitching aggression that suggested they had been broken and rebuilt in a lab. He looked at Rhea, whose silhouette was etched against the darkness by the pulsing silver light of her locket, and he felt a crushing weight of regret for every insult he had ever hurled at her. He had called her a beggar, but as she stood between him and certain death, she looked like the only sovereign this world had ever truly known. If you're ready to witness the true power of the Guardian's bloodline and see this arrogant boss finally realize who really rules the night, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and join the pack before the final reveal. The lead beast, a hulking mass of scarred fur and cybernetic implants, let out a sound that was less a howl and more a mechanical scream, launching itself across the clearing with lethal intent. Rhea didn't flinch, she didn't even draw a weapon. She simply reached up and snapped the silver clasp of the locket, releasing a wave of ancient, resonant energy that hit the clearing like a physical shockwave. The air hummed with a frequency so low it made Kael's teeth ache and the very ground beneath them vibrate with the power of the earth itself. Ghost, the silver wolf who had bowed to her on the first day, didn't just attack, he became a blur of ancestral fury, his movements synchronized perfectly with the pulse of light from Rhea's chest. Kael watched, mesmerized and humbled, as the girl he had treated like a servant commanded the very fabric of the wild, her voice rising in a melodic, terrifying chant that called the shadows to her side. But that was only the beginning of the transformation. As the syndicate's monsters were torn apart by the sheer force of nature Rhea had unleashed, David stepped back into the light, his face twisted in a mask of desperate, cowardly rage. He held a detonator in his hand, a fail-safe the Idaho Syndicate had installed to ensure that if they couldn't have the Guardian's blood, no one could. "You think you've won, little girl?" David spat, his thumb hovering over the red button. "I'll bury you and this entire estate under 10 feet of Maryland soil before I let a dog walker take what belongs to the company." Kael tried to lung for him, his fingers clawing at the dirt, but his body betrayed him, the blood loss turning the world into a spinning kaleidoscope of gray and red. He saw Rhea look at him, her amber eyes softening for just a fraction of a second, a look of such profound, tragic beauty that it hurt worse than the bullet in his shoulder. She knew what was coming. She knew the cost of what she was about to do. What she said next changed everything, because she didn't scream for help or beg for her life. She simply whispered a name, his name, and Kael felt a jolt of electricity move from her gaze into his very soul. "Remember me as more than just a dog walker, Kael," she said, her voice a silk ribbon of sound amidst the chaos. She turned back to David just as he depressed the button, but the explosion didn't happen. Instead, the ground didn't erupt with fire, it opened up with life. Massive, ancient roots from the surrounding oaks surged through the earth like living serpents, wrapping around David and his men, crushing the technology and the greed out of their bodies before they could even scream. The sheer, raw power of the Guardian's legacy was folding the forest around them, creating a sanctuary that was impenetrable to any weapon of man. Kael felt the world beginning to fade, his grip on Rhea's hand slipping as the darkness of unconsciousness pulled at his heels. He saw the wolf, Ghost, standing over him, the animal's eyes no longer wild but filled with a deep, sorrowful intelligence. He felt Rhea's cool hands on his face, her touch a balm that seemed to sew his soul back together even as his body failed. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her she was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. But the words died in his throat as the silver light from the locket expanded, swallowing the clearing, the woods, and the pain in a blinding, beautiful white. He didn't know the truth yet, but the sacrifice Rhea was making to save his life was one that would bind them together across every border from New York to Idaho. When he finally closed his eyes, the last thing he heard wasn't the sound of gunfire or the roar of the wind, it was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the forest, and the soft, whispered promise that the hunt was far from over. He woke up hours later in his own bed, the Maryland sun streaming through the windows of his mansion, but the silence of the house was deafening. Chris was standing at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. "She's gone, boss," Chris whispered, his voice trembling. "The woods, they've changed. There's a wall of thorns 10 feet thick around the entire perimeter, and no one can get through. Not even the army." Kael sat up, the pain in his shoulder a dull, echoing reminder of the night before, and he looked down at his nightstand. There, sitting on the polished mahogany, was the silver locket, its chain broken but its surface polished to a brilliant shine. Beside it was a single, muddy footprint of a wolf and a scrap of paper with 3 words written in a hand that was as elegant as it was firm: "I am yours." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent his whole life trying to own the world, but the only thing that mattered was the girl who had owned him without even trying. He realized then that he was no longer the king of the mafia, he was a servant to a power he was only beginning to understand. But the nightmare wasn't over, because as he reached for the locket, the television in the corner flickered to life, showing a news report from Washington. The Idaho Syndicate hadn't just been a group of mercenaries, they were a front for a global conglomerate that was now moving its assets into Maryland, and they were calling Rhea a terrorist, a biological threat that had to be neutralized at any cost. Kael felt a cold, hard resolve settle into his chest, a fire that burned brighter than any ambition he had ever known. He didn't care about the money or the territory anymore. He had a queen to find, and he had a wolf at his side who knew exactly where she was hiding. He looked at Chris, his eyes flashing with the same lethal light he had seen in the clearing. "Assemble everyone. We're not going to war for the city. We're going to war for the woods. He knew the truth now, and he knew that the beggarly dog walker was the only thing worth fighting for in a world of shadows. If you're ready to see the final showdown where the Mafia Boss risks everything to save the guardian of the pack, click on the like button now, subscribe and stay tuned, because the real battle is just beginning. The sky over the Potomac didn't just darken, it bruised, a deep, violet warning of the storm that was coming for the woman Kael had finally realized he couldn't live without. He stood on the edge of the thorn wall, the massive silver locket heavy in his palm, feeling the hum of the forest vibrating through the soles of his expensive leather boots. He had traded his charcoal suit for tactical gear, his eyes no longer reflecting the cold greed of a mafia prince, but the searing focus of a man who had found his purpose in the dirt and the shadows. Behind him, the remnants of his syndicate stood in a silent, disciplined line, but they weren't looking at him for orders. They were looking at Ghost, who sat at the boundary of the thorns like a sentinel of the old world. If you want to see the ultimate power of the pack unleashed and the final bowing of the world's elite, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment with your favorite character's name, and share this video with everyone who loves a legendary reveal. Kael didn't know if Rhea could hear him, but he spoke into the wind, his voice a low, gravelly promise that carried across the Maryland woods. I called you a beggar because I was too blind to see that I was the one starving for something real, he whispered, and for a moment, the thorns seemed to part, a narrow path appearing through the wall of spikes that had held the world at bay. He didn't hesitate, he stepped into the green dark, followed only by Ghost and the weight of his own transformation. But the peace was short-lived, because the sound of heavy rotors soon drowned out the whispers of the trees, and three massive, sleek transport helicopters bearing the logo of the Idaho conglomerate began to hover over the clearing. A woman named Sandra, the cold-eyed CEO who had ordered the destruction of Rhea's family, stepped onto the skid of the lead chopper, her voice amplified by a megaphone to sound like the voice of a god. The girl is a relic of a dead age, Kael. Give her up, or we level this entire county. Kael didn't look up, he only looked ahead at the figure emerging from the mist near the riverbank. Rhea stood there, her hair a wild halo of dark curls, her feet bare on the damp earth, and her eyes glowing with a silver light that matched the moon. She wasn't the girl who walked dogs for a pittance anymore, she was the living heart of the Potomac, the alpha of a pack that stretched back to the beginning of time. What she did next changed everything, because instead of running from the technology and the fire of the corporate world, she raised her arms and let out a howl that wasn't a cry of fear, but a command of absolute authority. The helicopters didn't just fail, they seemed to be pulled from the sky by invisible hands, the very air around them thickening until the rotors could no longer bite. One by one, the machines of the modern world were dragged into the soft, waiting mud of the riverbank, their high-tech sensors blinded by the raw magic of the earth. Sandra tumbled from her perch, her designer clothes stained with the same Maryland mud Kael had once mocked Rhea for wearing. The corporate queen looked up in terror as Ghost approached her, not with a snarl, but with a look of such profound, ancient judgment that she couldn't even find the breath to scream. Kael reached Rhea's side, his hand finding hers in the dark, and as their fingers intertwined, the silver light of the locket flared one last time, binding the Mafia's strength to the guardian spirit. The world didn't end with an explosion, it ended with a bow. From the depths of the woods, dozens of wolves emerged, followed by the silent, armored men of Kael's syndicate, and one by one, they all knelt in the dirt, not out of fear of a boss, but out of reverence for the woman who had survived the fire to lead them all. Kael knelt too, his head bowed at the feet of the beggarly dog walker, who had saved his soul from the hollow life he had built. He realized then that he didn't want to rule the city, he wanted to guard the gate with her. The silence that followed was the most powerful thing Kael had ever heard, a peace that was earned through blood and sacrifice. He looked up at Rhea, and for the first time, he saw a future that didn't involve shadows or secrets. They were the pack now, a bridge between the wild and the world, and any who dared to call her a beggar would have to answer to the king who had finally learned to follow. The resolution was total, a powerful shift in the hierarchy of the East Coast that left the viewers breathless and hungry for the next legend to rise. This was the moment the world realized that some things can't be bought, and some spirits will never, ever be broken. The silence that followed was the most powerful thing Kael had ever heard, a peace that was earned through blood and sacrifice. He looked up at Rhea, and for the first time, he saw a future that didn't involve shadows or secrets. They were the pack now, a bridge between the wild and the world, and any who dared to call her a beggar would have to answer to the king who had finally learned to follow. But as the first light of a new dawn breaks over the Potomac, this is only the first page of their legend. If you felt the power of the Guardian's bloodline and the heat of Kael's redemption, don't let the story end here. Make sure you smash that like button right now to show your support for Rhea's reign, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the high-stakes drama of the Melanin and the Mafia series. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with the word pack if you knew the wolf would bow from the start, and share this video with everyone who needs to see a queen take her throne. Your support keeps the story alive, and the next chapter is going to be even more explosive. Stay tuned, because in this world, the hunt never truly ends.